remember, we were doing Judaism. We didn't get to Genesis chapter 3, or did we? Hold on. Yeah, we did hit Genesis chapter 3, so we'll go right out of that into Genesis Revisited. So I just want to be very clear, here I am, that a number of scholars, a number of individuals, a number of environmentalists have revisited Jeffrey Lynn White Jr.'s thesis. And the idea here is it's been 50 years and people like, Pope Francis, Al Gore have approached Christianity in a more environmentally friendly way. And it's a great debate in that sense, or debate's probably wrong, discussion that was engendered by Lynn White Jr. because he really got people thinking about it. One of those people, if you're interested in this topic, was Jeremy Cohen, who wrote a book called, and this is actually quoting Genesis 1:28, "Be fertile, increase, fill the earth, and master it." And remember, this is the passage, or one of the passages that talked about dominion and why it was so important. But Jeremy Cohen, for example, feels that this can be read environmentally. So it's a bit of a task. He does it historically, but I just want to let you know that this is not the only approach, that people have been giving this a good bit of thought. And then finally, an epilogue on the whole thing. We can skip that iClicker. We already did that one. We'll do another one in a few minutes. It's very much a debate in the world today, especially in the US today, how we interpret Christianity from an environmental point of view. Some people, millennial thinkers, thinking that, the second coming is very soon, have a very different perspective than, other people that are projecting out with the IPCC, where we're going to be in 2050 or 2100. So, give you an example. This was sort of a turning point, 2007. James Dobson, who was the founder of a group called Focus on the Family. Well, what happened was the National Association of Evangelicals in the United States, an official there said, well, it's time for the evangelical community in the US to take climate change seriously. This is right after Al Gore had released that film, An Inconvenient Truth, and a number of other activists, a number of other Christians, including James Dobson, called for that individual to be fired. And that really kicked off what is still, 15 years later, a debate that is raging into different communities in the evangelical movement in the US, certainly, and Southern Baptist Conference in particular. And many of these individuals felt that, Al Gore and other liberals were trying to put forth this idea of climate change. But it raises this more fundamentally, this question, what it raised to John Donne, this, how much does the earth really matter, right? If we are just visitors here on the planet, if this is not our true home, if this is not even our true bodies here, then how much should we care about the earth, if we should care about it at all? Again, still very much being debated today. But it's a good thing insofar as, we want there to be discussion of these things. Okay. And it may be one of the most important questions of all, right? Just how much does the earth matter? Depends on, what you think of your relationship to it and all. But it's interesting because I think many people from a purely materialistic point of view would say, well, it matters a great deal. It's our home. It's, we rely on it for what we eat, what we drink, where we live, all that. But on the other hand, if it's not really your home, and ultimately you're not going to rely on it if you're in another realm, yeah. Okay, so that was the end of that lecture. And now we're getting into metaphysical thinking, but from the point of view of philosophy. So what we're just doing is theology. I mean, I think it's pretty clear the Judeo-Christian tradition is thoroughly, grounded in a religious stance. But the West, and we are, remember, looking at Western thought and how it's developed, is more than just the Judeo-Christian tradition. You'll often hear people talk about the Greco-Roman tradition. So in addition to that religious one we just had, they're the Greeks and Romans, and they greatly impacted our culture. By our culture, I mean Western culture, and by Western culture, I mean they greatly impacted ultimately Europe and European countries, which then through the colonial project impacted the rest of the world. So, but to do this, you kind of have to understand how the philosophy works, which is what we're going to do. But first, we're going to look at Mr. Hesiod here. Hesiod is in the reader. He's environmentally significant because he recounts two creation myths, both which parallel the Genesis story. And the idea here is just simple, that the earth was once a perfect place for human beings. Everything was once perfect for human beings. There was great harmony with all animals. Everything was wonderful. Mother Earth took care of us all. The important concept here is the notion of locus aminus, which means locus is coming out of the Latin. Locus, you might guess, our word locale comes from it. It means place. Aminus, if you think about it, you can see our word amiable coming out of it. So it's an amiable locale or a pleasant place. The notion is simply that Hesiod, arguing basically from a historical point of view, he said, human beings once lived at peace with the planet. And I mean, walk you through that, but already you can see the parallel with the Genesis account. Genesis, one time everything was great. We call that Eden. Hesiod had another name for it. But in the second of his two stories, Hesiod suggests that there was once a golden race of mortal men. By the way, you will most likely have encountered this idea not as golden race, but golden age. So Hesiod is Greek. By the time it gets into Roman thinking, like with Virgil, they're calling it the Golden Age, and you might have heard this. The Woody Allen film, what is it, Midnight in Paris, where it's Golden Age becomes like a central thing and motif in it. But there was once this time, there was a golden race of mortal men that had all good things for the fruitful earth. In other words, a benevolent Mother Earth, unforced, bear them fruit abundantly. They dwelt in ease and peace upon the lands with many good things, rich in flocks. So same story, Mother Earth is benevolent, cares for human beings, everything is wonderful, there's abundance everywhere, you don't need to do agriculture, you just, if you're hungry, you go out and pick some fruit or whatever. And central here, we'll talk about this in a minute, they dwelt in ease and peace upon their lands. So this flocks thing is interesting. They were rich in flocks, and we're going to see this when we get to pastoral, which we'll do next lecture with another Greek named Theocritus. This was how it was actually imagined. In other words, what was the original place like? Well, we know from Adam and Eve, from the Garden of Eden, we kind of have that, Hebrew interpretation, but here it was imagined where human beings had flocks, had sheep, and they just wandered with their sheep. They didn't do any agriculture in the sense of planting and harvesting and anything like that. And that was kind of it. So you will see this, by the way, when we get to pastoral, we're going to see thousands of years of art in the West about shepherds and their flocks. And that, what's being depicted there, is the natural state of human beings, the way things were before things started to go bad. And how soon did they go bad? Well, you'll see just in a minute or two, actually. The break with the perfect past, Hesiod's time, which he calls the Golden Age. So he's writing 2,700 years ago. Again, he's a Greek thinker. I'm sorry, he calls the Iron Age. And he says in his age, his contemporary period was the Iron Age, and human beings could never rest from labor and sorrow. So it's very much like the post-lapsarian world of Genesis. So in other words, after the fall in Genesis, Adam has that, he has to suffer labor. That's the consequence for the fall. And in Hesiod's time, and again, it's not surprising, it's coming out of like the same portion of the world, labor is also central here. And it's also very clear that, we often think like, when did things go wrong? Was it maybe 100 years ago in the US or 200 environmentally things were better? Well, Hesiod, writing 2,700 years ago, thought that things were already all screwed up. So for him, he has to look back to an earlier period, the Golden Age, to find that. So it's just interesting in the West, you will never find a time where people said, ha, this is the age. This is the wonderful time. They're always looking back, whether they call it Eden, whether they call it the golden race, whether they call it the golden age, whether they call it the pastoral ideal. It's always the same. Prior to the golden race, and again, coming out of the same part of the world, it may be not surprising to you, these stories are kind of similar. We have a woman, Pandora, who, having both a shameless mind and a deceitful nature, metaphorically stands for all women. So what went wrong in Eden? Well, Eve, in the tradition, seduces Adam. It certainly appeals to him with the idea of having forbidden fruit. Here we have another woman, Pandora, who is the source of the problem. So in each case, everything was great. We lived at peace with the planet. And then a woman who metaphorically stands for all women screwed everything up. Yeah. So before that, before Pandora, to destroy the perfect relationship that human beings had to the planet, the tribes of men lived on Earth remotely and free from ills and hard toil and heavy sickness. So they didn't have to work, they didn't have to do agriculture, there wasn't sickness, everything was peaceful, everything was fine. And then, like Eve, Pandora comes on the scene and ruins it. So obviously, and we can talk about it and are talking about it from an environmental point of view, but it's clearly deeply misogynistic in both traditions, in that, you know, it's a patriarchal culture that will try to find, you know, acknowledging that nothing is, that the world is no longer perfect, and Hesiod had acknowledged this 2,700 years ago. But then, how did it go wrong? What went wrong? Let's come up with a story to explain it. And in each case, it's a woman who introduces evil into the world. Evil into the world in the Pandora account, or Eve releases sin into the world. Who has Eve, who has, you know, you should probably say this of Eve too, maybe you wouldn't, I don't know, but Hesiod certainly says it of Pandora. She has a shameless mind and a deceitful nature, and she is imagined, like Eve, as a seductress. And of course, this lives on today. So this sort of very misogynistic portrayal of women coming out of a patriarchal culture. This has been in the West from the very beginning. In fact, it's an explanation for evil in the world. I mean, if it's not bad enough that you're portraying women this way, you're saying they are ground zero for causing the problem of evil in the world. If women weren't in the world, everything would be wonderful. You know? So problematic. And you can see why there's a whole group of scholars known as ecofeminists, which include myself, who focus on this as a relationship, an intersectional relationship between environmental and gender and other issues. As improbable as it sounds, here we are 2,700 years later. Even today, in some sense, we buy into this notion that there was once a time when human beings lived at peace with the planet. And why do we do that? I mean, we know from the historical record, well, I mean, from the historical record, where would that be exactly? I mean, human beings have been all over the planet for tens of thousands of years. I mean, are we supposed to go back to when we first, you know, made the exodus out of Africa? How far back do we go? Does this include Neanderthals? I mean, or in what communities does it include all over the planet? There are all these different communities of people. But there's no one group that really had it together, and certainly not the West, insofar as I suggested last time, we have never been sustainable. The time before last with Gilgamesh, I mean, the idea of our ambition being greater than the area that could sustain us, so we had to do things like, you know, deforestation and all, that's been with us forever in the West, or for as long as we've been in the West. Okay, Hesiod. We're going to change channels a little here, staying with Greek thinking, and ask this really important question we haven't asked before quite, and that is, what is nature? And it's an interesting because we kind of take it for granted. People use the word nature a lot. I bet you use it almost daily or a variation of it, talking about like natural products or getting out into nature and things. But first, let's take an iClicker poll. Let me start the poll here. Let me select that. And it's now counting. Just curious how you found this reading by Hesiod. I'll just say it. I'll tell you what I think before we actually looked at it. See what you thought. Yeah, I thought this is kind of one of the most boring readings we've had. And like I said, if you Gilgamesh, I hope you like Gilgamesh because Gilgamesh is better. But let me just explain why we have something like Hesiod. Think how important he is. Hesiod is like ground zero where this myth starts in the Greek tradition about Pandora and women being evil and all. It's just essential that we confront him. Without confronting him, yeah. So let's see. How many people I liked it? How many people hit D for I liked it? 118 people. The most boring thing I've ever read. Oh, well, that's not bad at all. That's not bad at all. Well, of course, 270 people haven't read it yet, so I guess that has some bearing on it. But okay. Now that we've done that, we can all settle down and jump to the next actual slide. What is nature? So Raymond Williams is an environmental critic from the 1970s, once remarked that what makes this question difficult is that nature may be the most complex word in the English language, as it has accumulated many, many meanings over time. In fact, some people have looked at this, scholars, and identified over 60 different meanings for the word nature. It is, according to Williams, one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language. So it's a chore to do this, but we're gonna come out of it in a different way from a Greek perspective, an ancient Greek perspective. But to know, so nature, our word nature comes from the Latin natura. If you look at natura, you can pretty obviously see. But also, the concept of nature is coming out of Greek thinking as well, and the Greek word is physis. If you substitute that U for a Y, it look like physis, you may see that our word physical and the variations of physical come from that. And also from natura, a lot of words like natal come from it, relating to birth and all. And even more confusing, there's an Old English word that's still floating around in our cultural memory, kinda. And if you take that Y and you substitute an I and you drop the E, you get the word kind. And that's one of the meanings of nature. So in other words, you say like, what kind is that dog? If you're asking about, their breed or something, where you're really saying is, what is the nature of that dog? It's like a more specific way of putting it. But anyhow, I just wanted to let you know it's a complicated word, but we're going to look particularly at that Greek word for physis. Also noteworthy, and we kind of have to confront this if we're going to move beyond it to get to a Greek understanding. Today, nature is often used synonymously, like with environment or landscape or wilderness. You go to Yosemite because you want to experience the nature there. We often think of nature being at places that are like wilderness. We don't think, for example, you're going into this lecture hall to experience nature. Although from the Greek sense, well, you are. But in any event, we tend not to think that. We tend to think of nature. And this really, Milton in the 17th century is more responsible for this than anyone. It doesn't happen until the 17th century. People wouldn't have thought of nature as being like wilderness a few hundred years ago. But let's continue on. So you can see this particular definition of nature or concept of nature, where you remember in Gilgamesh, it was important from the very beginning that Uruk was surrounded by the wall, that what was inside was different, and what's outside the wall was nature. And what was inside was created by humans, it's culture. And that dyad appears again and again and will get inverted in later Greek philosophical thinking. But just so you know, it's always been there in the West, although Greeks had a different approach to it. Yep. Yeah. Why this dyad of nature culture is so important is it imagines human beings as separate and apart from nature. In other cultures, we're going to see this with lecture 17 with Buddhism, for example, human beings are seen as integrally part of nature. They're not separate from it. So if you think of it that way, think of it like if we're an animal like any other animal, then we're part of nature, right? Why would we say that, a buffalo is more part of nature than we are? We would be part of it. But as we saw in the creation myth from Christianity, human beings are seen as fundamentally different. Yeah. Why can I hear people talking? Okay. So when we use nature synonymous with wilderness, like we want to get out into nature, we want to go to a park, we want to go somewhere like that, we're for the most part conceiving of it spatially, and this is important. That's someplace we can actually visit. So in other words, I'm tired of being cooped up here, I want to go out into nature. Well, even outside into that grassy area in front of the hall here is nature, but you have to go to nature. It's someplace you can go to. And you might think, well, that's nature, but it's not really good nature. A really good nature would be like Yosemite, or maybe that's even kind of, crowded now. We should go maybe to Alaska somewhere. That's really nature. But whenever you do that, you're talking about going to there. So that's sort of spatial. It's like going from this space to that space. We tend to think of it that way. The ancient Greeks used the word nature, generally did not think of it spatially. Rather, they understood it temporally. And this is a big distinction here. And I'm going to spend a good bit of time explaining that. And I'm going to do it by looking at a landscape artist named Andy Goldsworthy. It just seems to me he has it's a visual. If we see this visually, and I'm going to show you a number of art installations, and you can see what is meant by nature. I used to have the class watch a documentary called Rivers and Tides. If you want to, I'll put it up on GauchoCast. You can watch it. It's a very beautiful documentary. Yeah. But our reason for doing it, just so we're clear, because I'm just going to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes talking about Andy Goldsworthy. I don't want you to lose sight of why I'm doing it. It's to reclaim this Greek notion of phusis. It's to try to understand how you can see nature in an entirely different way from the way we do now in the modern West. And I think you'll see it has profound implications for how we interact with the planet. But just remember, I'll get back to this. I'll get back to the nature thing, phusis, when we get to Heraclitus. And you can see we're going to get to Heraclitus here, and then we're going to get to Plato. But to do that, we're going to go through Andy Goldsworthy. So let's just jump right in. So this is a typical installation by Andy Goldsworthy. It's a serpentine ice sculpture. If you did want to watch that documentary, it has something similar in image that opens up the documentary. And he wants to draw attention to the fact that nature is temporal, endlessly emerging and decaying and in flux. So he makes this installation to drive that point home. Almost every one of his installations drives that home. So let me explain how. These installations make virtually no attempt to hold off change. Rather, they draw attention to it and celebrate nature as endlessly changing. If Goldsworthy had wanted a sculpture that endured, he could have carved one out of marble or granite. So let me just go back to that and show you, and just, I'm going to explain this in detail, but just the first pass. He made this thing out of an icicle, and an icicle which he broke apart And you can see him in the documentary doing it painstakingly stuck back together again, and not in a super high-tech way. He breaks it and then he sort of licks it to make it like, warm, so then he can stick it together, and he makes this. Why does he do that? Because this thing is not going to last more than a few minutes or a few hours at best. Especially now the sun is shining on it, it's going to start melting, and this installation will decay instantly. It is designed to draw attention to the fact that nature is endlessly changing and decaying. So that's my first pass. Let me go through and explain that in more detail. And again, if he wanted to make something that was really going to endure, if he wanted to do that, well, we would have carved it out of granite or made it even, less fragile and ephemeral looking, like a solid, like obelisk or something. But that's just the opposite of what he wants to do. Just a little thing that may have occurred to you. Goldsworthy principally makes his living, as far as I know, from photographing these installations. And he has beautiful books, beautiful coffee table books that have wonderful photographs, including the one we just saw in them. And you can see there's kind of a problem here, right? In that if he wants things that just to decay, he shouldn't make something that endures. The photographs are going to endure maybe for hundreds of years. It's kind of a cop out, but he does have to make a living, I guess. But I just want to draw attention to the fact that it's kind of like an easy shot to make against Andy Goldsworthy, that like if he wants these things to decay, he should have sold tickets to the performance of him doing it, and then it would have been it. But he often does these in very remote places. So anyhow, but think of it this way, and this is the way the Greeks would have thought of it. Think of it, these installations that what you just saw with the icicle, as emulating something like a blossoming rose. He's trying to emulate nature. Let me explain that. Like the rose, Goldsworthy's ice sculpture emerges completely into being for just one shining moment, then immediately falls away. And this is the actual one from the film. The perfect moment when the sunshine backlit the sculpture, like what we're seeing here. The sun, he made this thing really early. He starts making it when it's dark, and now the sun is coming up and shining on it, and it's perfect. I mean, this is like the perfect blossoming rose. I mean, if you could figure out the one instant when a rose has come into perfection and in the sense of a full bloom, this is like that. But here's the catch. This moment also signals the end of the sculpture, because the sun, which is doing that amazing backlighting, is also beginning to melt it. And so give it a couple hours, few hours, it's going to start falling apart. Time is central here, because what he wants to draw attention to is everything in nature, like a rose, comes into being, is there for one moment, and then decays. And we'll see this. I hinted at it already. But this is a concept of nature, but I'll say it after showing you some more examples in case it wasn't clear. So he does this. This is Andy Goldsworthy, if you want to actually see him working. He picks up little sticks off the ground, and he created this sort of flat mosaic, and you can see how fragile this looks. And in fact, in the documentary, you see him making this. It's so fragile, he never makes it. He keeps trying to make it, and it keeps collapsing. But again, he wants something that's not going to endure. Another installation, you could try this one at home, or at least out in your yard if you want. This is Andy Goldsworthy. He lies down on some gravel right before it starts to rain. And then when he gets up, this image of him is left, and that's the installation. The point is, once he gets up, if it's still raining, how long will that last? Moments, really. The instant he gets up, it is going to be decaying. But there it is, like that perfect rose, like that ice sculpture, in its moment, there it is, perfection. He also releases a bunch of minerals, which he ground up rocks to do it down a stream, and that's important when we get to Heraclitus, and I'll explain it. But let me just I put this on a second set here because it's so there's so many of these. But I also thought these are kind of fun to look at. They're striking installations. This is a wall he built. If you can see, this is a stone wall. It's called a serpentine wall, and you can see it here as well. He's playing with the same idea, but with different time frames. So you might think, if you look at this here, that's going to last forever. It's made out of stone. That's not made out of little twigs or icicles. But he draws attention to the fact that it won't, because all of the stones that made up this wall, he got from local walls that had already decayed. So you may know there's a practice in, this is in New England, New York, but it's also in Europe and England and all, where farmers, when they wanted to plow their fields and all, they'd encounter rocks. So they'd take all the rocks and they'd put them at the edge of fields, and they ultimately built little stone walls. The problem is those walls don't last forever. Even stone walls will collapse, and Goldsworthy's point of view, even though this looks like it's going to last forever and may last quite a while, if it's anything like those stone walls, give it a century, 2, 3, and it'll be rubble. And this will collapse too, just like the icicle sculpture. He loves these things, which are kerns, which are similar. If you've ever gone hiking, people sometimes put like a little pile of rocks so you know like where a trail is turning or something. He's made it into an art form. Again, it looks like these things would last forever, but on the other hand, it's not a very stable shape here. In other words, if you wanted it to be stable, we probably would have brought it down all the way, but not. So this looks great, may look great a decade, 2 decades from now, but eventually it will start decaying. This one especially because it's not on this sort of foundational piece here. So again, even though we're talking a different time frame, decades here, you're still talking about inevitable decay. Goldsworthy's not the only person to do it. So this sort of art, this is Patrick Doherty, and this was actually at the Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens back in 2005. He built this little building called Toad Hill out of vines, basically, kind of like ivy vines or grapevines or something. And it looked rather amazing. And I saw it when it was here because I arrived in Santa Barbara in 2006, but by then it was already decaying. And a year later, the Botanic Garden had to first close it off, because you could actually go through and walk through this and all. But after a couple of years, it was beginning to collapse and it wasn't safe to do that anymore. And after another year or so, it just collapsed so much that they had to get rid of it. And even though that might seem like a shame, that was the whole point, that it would collapse. He does these things all over the world. He likes working with vines. Some of them like this are just incredibly dramatic. This one's made a few years later. And like Toad Hill, this one no longer exists. It went out of existence. So here's the question, there's Andy Goldsworthy working. What is nature? Goldsworthy has an answer for us. Drum roll, please. Nature is birth, growth, and passing away. The endless process of process whereby everything everywhere is ever coming into and out of being. This is temporal. So in other words, even the universe, even, the Big Bang, is going to change and go out of existence. We know now the universe is just going to continue expanding till it kind of goes dark when all the stars end and all. But everything that you see, certainly everything on Earth that you ever encounter, even though it might be something that you think is really solid, like that stone wall, or more solid, like a mountain, that will end too. Everything does. That's the nature of nature. Nature has to be seen temporally as change, as becoming, as that which just keeps going on and on. Things come into being, things go out of being. That includes everything, including you and me. We come into the world, we go out of the world. We're here for a time. And you can see already, just kind of as a spoiler, but this is different, right, than this Judeo-Christian thinking, whereas you come into the world, but then you go to that next world, heaven, and you are there forever. You never grow old. There is no change. There's no birth. There's no passing away. Everything is just perfect. But according to Andy Goldsworthy and the early Greek thinkers, that's not the way this particular world is. Other artists, including people and the among the Greeks, tried to make things that would last forever. There's a real propensity for that in early Western thinking. Think pyramids. Think this, the Apocalypse Greek thinking, Greek buildings here. They were made out of marble, this one in particular, and it was made to last forever, and it's not. It too will decay. Might take a couple thousand years in this case, and it might take, unfortunately, other stressors to do it. And we know, for example, that many buildings like this are decaying because of air pollution, because of things like when you burn fossil fuels, you create problems like CO2 and all, which leads to the climate crisis. But you also do things like release sulfur into the atmosphere, and that goes up as sulfur dioxide and comes back to the earth as acid rain, which can eat into even minerals like marble and things like this. So back to why we're doing this. From our point of view, it's important to note that Goldsworthy's concept of nature is very similar to those held by pre-Socratic philosophers, one of which you read, who is Heraclitus. So let's jump now from our brief little visit with Andy Goldsworthy to Heraclitus, but not first without taking another poll. I'm just curious. I can ask this question because you've now seen some of this art. You may have not be very familiar with landscape art already. Maybe you were. But if not, what did you make of that? It's very different, right? I mean, we have this notion of art as things that like show up in museums and all. But to actually use nature in the sense of things that were not modified by human beings to make art, yeah, so I'm just curious if you like this or not. Yes, a great majority of people found it very interesting. 16 people did not. That number was just 17. Someone changed their mind quickly. Anyhow, yeah, so there we go. Okay, if you haven't answered, make sure you answer, but let's continue moving on. Heraclitus. Heraclitus is a pre-Socratic philosopher, meaning that, and this is important for us, the world changes with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and in a very important way for us, which we're going to see directly. But the group of philosophers before them, like Parmenides and Heraclitus, are generally called pre-Socratic. They are the before Socrates. He makes a famous statement. It's impossible to step twice into the same stream. Why? Because he believes that all of nature was in fact an endlessly streaming stream, wildly in flux, as everywhere in this view, everything is constantly shifting across time, no sooner coming into than going out of being. So again, think one of Andy Goldsworthy's installations, think a rose. Everything is constantly changing. Heraclitus says it's changing so quickly that if you put your foot into a stream and then put it back in again, of course it's different. Why? Because all that water, if it is streaming, right, moving, all the water that you just touched, what constitutes the stream, is no longer there because it is streamed on, and now it's a new stream that you're stepping into. And he said, and we're going to see, it is kind of a wonderful metaphor for nature understood in this temporal sense, as that which keeps changing all the time. So if you want to think about nature in this sense, think about Goldsworthy's installation, think about a rose, but mainly think about a stream, because a stream is constantly streaming. And that's what Heraclitus said was nature was doing. An example would be a rose or one of Goldsworthy's sculptures. Across the planet, everything is doing this. Flowers are doing it. Everything's doing it. We're doing it. This is why And this is arguably not just something that Heraclitus came up with. This is Greek thinking. This is before Plato and Socrates came on the scene. This is what most Greek people believed. And by the way, this is still believed by all sorts of other cultures. We're going to see it again with Buddhism. We could see it with any number of ideologies. But in the West, it will change. But this notion that, phusis is this temporal thing, this always changing thing. It's not spatial, and it doesn't make sense to talk of nature spatially. So we said, I remember, in a modern sense, I want to go see nature. I want to go outside those doors. I want to go to a park. I want to go to Yosemite. No, nature is here. Everything here is nature. This is the way it is. This building may seem like it is going to endure for a long time. This building will be gone soon too. Everything will be gone. That's just the way it is. And the hardest thing to come to grips with is you may not have a particular attachment to this building, and who cares if this building's gone in a few decades, but you will be gone too. We will all be gone in this view. It's just the nature of nature. Yep. So to this way of thinking, it doesn't make as much sense to talk about nature spatially. Why should we say, I want to go out to be with nature? Nature's right here now. If you want to experience nature, take a deep breath, close your eyes, and you can experience it. It is happening here. It is happening within us. The installations are obviously located somewhere, but the goal of Goldsworthy's installations, the goal of what Heraclitus is doing, is to reveal nature as becoming, as emergence and passing away. That will be the word that they use, that Heraclitus used. You don't have to know. It's in Greek. It is gignomai. It means becoming. So something is not eternally being the same, but it's constantly becoming, it's constantly changing, it's becoming this, it's becoming that, it's becoming alive, it's becoming dead, it's always in the notion it's always becoming. But here comes a huge shift with Mr. Plato. He's writing just a generation or so after Heraclitus. In fact, one of Heraclitus's students, who I'll introduce in a minute, is one of Plato's teachers. Plato and Socrates will radically redefine phusis, radically redefine nature. And indeed, it's actually a deconstruction. It's like the seminal deconstruction in Western thinking. It will no longer signal the process where everything is emerging and then passing away, but rather reference what never passes away, but endures permanently. So in other words, what is nature to Heraclitus, to Andy Goldsworthy? It's what's constantly changing. It's everything, everywhere it's changing like a rose. What is it to Plato? It's that which never changes, ever. Now you may ask the question, what could that be? Because if this building's going to go away, if the Great Pyramids are going to go away, if the universe is going to go away, what could it possibly be that would endure and not change and never go away? Plato, Socrates have an answer. So, because nothing in nature is permanent, not even the universe is permanent, nothing, certainly nothing on Earth, certainly not the Earth. The Earth just has a few billion years to go, not even 10 billion, and it's, the Earth's not going to be here and the sun will go out. He has to make a huge shift. It's an epistemological shift, meaning a shift in thinking, to imagine not a physical realm. And remember that word physical is physical comes from phusis. It has to be a metaphysical world, a world beyond phusis, beyond change. And that's what Plato and Socrates introduced into Western thinking. I could have had you read Plato. It's difficult to read Plato, and the passages are all kind of long and not so great. So there's Abernathy's Introduction to Metaphysics, which is just one of any number of introductions I could have given you, but it explains what Plato was up to. So what does Plato know? He knows full well that Greek's concept of phusis signaled flux, right? Endless change and becoming, passing away, like the rose, like Andy Goldsworthy's installations. In fact, one of Plato's teachers I mentioned was in fact Cratylus, who was in turn Heraclitus's student. So Plato, knows this really well, especially, let me just go to the next slide. Credulus actually it's not that he disagrees with Heraclitus, he totally agrees and takes it further. And what Credulus says is, you can't even step in the same river once, because with the moment your foot is in there, that river has already flowed. Even if you're super fast and you put your foot in and pull it out, it's not even the same river. Who will radicalize this even more, but I can't give him to you now because he's not in this tradition at all, but is the Buddha, in that he argues something even more radical. Not only can't you step into the same river twice, the river will have changed. He argues, you're not the same person. You've actually changed. If you think that you are the same person, forget it. You're changed. But forget him for the moment. We'll get to him. But certainly here, Plato is coming into this tradition with a teacher like Credulus, who is like radically suggesting everything is in flux and becoming. So contrary to Heraclitus and Credulus, Socrates, who is another one of Plato's teachers, they argued that there must be something more than the ever-changing existence that we apprehend through sense experience. So in other words, sense experience, we imagine 5 of them, different cultures imagine more, but 5. Everything you see, everything you smell, everything you hear, everything you touch, everything that you know comes from sense experience. Since you're experiencing this world here, that means everything you experience is changing. It's this phusis is everywhere. Everything changes. It's just the way it is. And sense experience will only confirm that. Go out and, walk into a forest and then go back to that forest a few months later. If it's a place that has a lot of, more seasonal change than Santa Barbara, it will look entirely differently. Maybe in the fall, everything is now brown. In the spring, it was green. But everything is changing, and you know that because it's how you sense it, how you're experiencing it. Socrates and Plato postulated that there must be a fixed and immutable realm of ideas, and that word idea is important there, free of change. They call this the metaphysical realm. Metaphysical, in their terms, metaphysical, and that literally means beyond phusis. So if phusis is constantly changing everywhere here, they imagine there must be some place where it's beyond all this change. And that's where we get our word metaphysical from. And where things just are, that they don't come into being and go out of being, they don't decay, that a rose just sits there perfectly, never, ever changing. This is Plato's, you've probably heard of it, his theory of ideas. Theory of ideas, often called theory of the Ide, and that's the original. He has a couple words for idea, but Ide is actually one of the forms of his word for idea. And our word idea comes from Plato, by the way. It comes from Greek and influenced more by Plato than anyone, I suppose. But his theory of ideas is that there's another realm outside of the physical where nothing ever changes. And you can see right now, not to be a spoiler where we're going, but this is starting to sound like the Christian notion of heaven, where that's another realm, a metaphysical realm. And just like that, Plato didn't think you could get to this place. It's not like you could fly up and out of the atmosphere and get to it. It is kind of like the multiverse. It's somewhere here, but not here. But he believed he could access it. Anyhow, he goes further. His realm of ideas is just the opposite of a realm of becoming. And by that, I mean where everything everywhere is ever coming into and out of existence. That's not what it is. That's what this world is. His world of ideas is the opposite of it. Everything is just the way it is and forever and ever is. It's a realm of being. And again, you'll hear this echoed in Christianity, where things are. It's where you have eternal life, where things ever and ever are. It's what Plato meant too. And that's why Christian philosophers, especially in the medieval period, they will begin connecting up the Christian tradition with the Greco-Roman tradition. And they will say things like, Plato was really talking about the same kind of thing. He didn't have it quite right because he was writing a few hundred years before Jesus came, but the same basic idea here, that his realm of ideas is akin to the Christian heaven, insofar as they're both, by definition, metaphysical realms outside of the physical, and everything there never changes. So similar to Christian metaphysical theology, which we've already encountered, Socrates and Plato imagine a metaphysical realm superior to the physical realm. And make no mistake, they call it superior. This realm, in the Republic, it's a great book if you ever want to read it, maybe Plato's best. He has a lot of shorter dialogues, but the Republic is good. In the book 10 of the Republic, he says everything here is just an inferior copy of the realm of ideas. So if you go out and see a tree out there, in the realm of ideas, there's the A-day of a tree, and it's perfect, and it never changes. And whatever you see here is just like made by a craftsperson, and an inferior one at that. Then, in what becomes perhaps the most radical deconstruction of thinking in the West, or maybe ever, Plato comes out and says that the metaphysical realm is true nature. So let me just repeat that or restate it. Everything that you've seen is actually an illusion. This is not the real world here. This, when you go out and see trees and all, it's just a copy of the superior realm, the realm of ideas. That realm is true nature. Plato will take the word physis, take the concept of nature, and say, no, it's not about change. It's not about coming into and out of being. It's not like a rose that dies and all that. It has nothing to do with it. It is fixed and eternal. That's what matters, that other realm. This one is just an inferior copy. So, the significance of this maneuver, you can't overstress it, as they boldly argue that the metaphysical realm, like the Christian heaven, is the preferred place. The earth, the physical realm, is seen as inferior. Again, we see that with Christian thinking insofar as the metaphysical realm, heaven, is this wonderful place where we ultimately are going, and down here is a realm with like sin and bad things potentially. Well, Plato has something similar in mind, and you can see why this is important, because when this starts getting merged in the medieval period into early modern, the Western tradition will take Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian thinking and kind of nicely dovetail them together, insofar as the real focus is on the metaphysical and not the physical, not the earthly. So Heraclitus is actually interesting, because of a philosopher in the 20th century named Martin Heidegger. And I want to give Heidegger his due, but I also want to warn you about him, in that it is absolutely the case. Well, so Heidegger writes his most famous book, Sein und Being in Time, in 1927. And he's German. He lives in Germany. That year might worry you, and it should. Heidegger is affiliated with the Nazi Party, and his thinking actually is plagued by similar thinking. So I won't go into a lot with Heidegger, but Heidegger is not a good guy, and Heidegger's a problem. But Heidegger did have something interesting to say here, so we're going to bracket off the fact that he's pretty much evil, and talk about the good thing that he actually explained. So he's aware that physis originally signaled endlessly becoming. Heidegger's a scholar of Greek thinking. He reads Greek and all. He knows that. And what do we mean by that? Things coming into being and passing away like a rose. And he knows that's what physis was to pre-Socratic thinkers like Heraclitus and Cratylus and others. And he knows that Socrates and Plato deconstructed that they reversed it, that they said that this is an inferior realm, and that is what we live in. Heidegger says that this marks a turning point in Western thinking. And I think he's right in that it inaugurates a metaphysics of presence, which privileges things that are constantly present, such as Plato's ideas, over the endless play of absence and presence. So I had to introduce Heidegger because he's just central for coming up with this idea that the Greeks named phusis. So what's the word presence mean here? Because it's going to matter. We're going to talk about a dam in a minute. It's just this idea that something is present for a moment, like the rose, and then it's absent. You know, see a beautiful rose, go there a month later, there's nothing left of it. It's nature is an endless play of absence and presence. We are here now alive. We are present here. We will be absent 100 years from now. It's just the way it is. Heidegger sees that what Plato did was to say, I don't like that. I only want to talk about things that are constantly present. Heidegger argues, and this is why he matters to us, that modern technology can be seen as the completion of metaphysics, the completion of the metaphysics of presence. In order to do so, he wrote a famous article on a dam that was being built into the Rhine River after the Second World War. So we have to go back to understand the importance of this, and it does explain a lot about why we think the way we do about things like fossil fuels. We need to look at Heraclitus's stream again. So to Heraclitus, remember, a streaming stream is a near perfect metaphor for phusis. So I keep going back to the rose. Rose comes into being and out, but a stream is even better because the water, at least in there, is constantly moving, constantly streaming. I mean, we actually name it for what it is. We call it the stream, this endless changing. You can never step twice into the same stream, according to Heraclitus, because by the time you step in, it's already streamed away. Streams are also interesting to think about. I'm thinking rivers too, is over longer periods of time, they change as well. So, you know, you have this image of a quietly streaming stream or a slowly moving river. But at times it will completely be absent, using Heraclitus, using Heidegger's word, absence. When will be absent? Well, during a drought. You know, a drought, the right time of year, during a mega drought like we've been experiencing in the 21st in California, it could go away completely, where once there had been a stream, there was no stream at all. Not a single drop of water was streaming. And at other times, it can be present, but so abundantly present that it's no longer a stream. It becomes a torrent, or a whole area will flood out. And in that sense, it's really not quite a stream anymore either. It's a lake, or we'll see in a moment with Heidegger, reservoir. So think about it, though, if you're a human being that lives near one of these streams, that's pretty tough. We talked about this before. How do you depend on a sporadically streaming stream, right? So sometimes, you know, and by the way, most people I mentioned on the planet live near bodies of water, it's 70%. Most people, you know, had a problem if the stream goes away and you're relying on this for water to drink or to cook or to irrigate with. That's a problem. And other times it can be so life-threatening that, you know, many people will die. So this is really tough. I mean, it's one thing to say nature is constantly changing. Isn't that nice? Yes. But on the other hand, this has real world consequences. To trying to adapt yourself to a nature that is constantly changing, constantly absent sometimes, present sometimes, overwhelming presence sometimes, that's an issue. And Martin Heidegger argues, yeah, human beings have never liked that situation, because that does not it's not an easy way to live, let's put it that way. So we talked about Heraclitus' stream. Let's talk about Heidegger's dam, but not with having another eye clicker. Well, what was I asking this question for? Have you been finding the readings and lectures beneficial? So are these Yeah, I'll just leave it that way, beneficial, useful for you. Yes, generally less. Many people will be behind with the readings. That's okay. But I'm just wondering, yeah, what your takeaway is. We hit 500. Let's see. Yes, generally less, somewhat clearly. For the most part, no. Again, a minority here. Okay, good to know. Okay, let's continue. And this is once we get through these, we'll be done. So, but this is going to change the way you think about modern technology, I hope. So Heidegger again is writing about this dam being built in the Rhine. And he argues that this dam responds to the frustration of the inconstancy of the streaming stream, the river, as it's a massive dam intended to convert the river into a reservoir, which no longer sporadically is streaming, but is on call, ready for use at any time, constantly present. So here's the idea. You live near a stream, say a river, in this case, the Rhine. It's great. Sometimes, though, not enough water, sometimes too much water. Wouldn't it be great if it always had just the right amount of water? And wouldn't it be great if you could just kind of like turn a valve and get that water, just the right amount that you want? If you want to like irrigate some fields, turn the valve a little bit. If you want to get a shower, turn the valve a little bit. Human beings never had this luxury. I mean, that's not the way nature works. Phusis is always changing. You get what you get. And you can see why in Gilgamesh's time, worried about that, you better make nice with the genus Loki in charge of that river so that you get something reasonable. But Heidegger said, yeah, in the West, human beings don't like that idea. Our goal, our dream has always been constant presence, things that aren't an endless play of absence and presence, endlessly changing, but just the way we want. And here it is. Here's an example of how we engineer that. And it's a perfect example because since the stream is a perfect example of Phusis, here we have it put to an end. And what happens? Well, that stream is no longer a stream in the sense that it is now a reservoir, and we have built massive valves on it that we can turn it on and off whenever we want. And by the way, this is one example of it, the Hoover Dam, which, has this great reservoir. Lake Powell is another one. The Three Gorges Dam, which was just completed like a decade ago in China, is the biggest ever on the planet. And that is so big. The reservoir that it created is so big, it was able to stockpile so much water behind it that the Earth is slightly wobbling on its axis because we changed the distribution of mass on the planet when we created that reservoir. And why have we done this? Well, Heidegger's answer is pretty clear. We created this into constant presence. We're unhappy with nature being changed, and we made it something which never changes. He calls it the completion of metaphysics because the builders of the dam have, in some sense, enacted what Plato's dream was, to be free of the ravages of time. Plato imagined a river that never changed in this realm of ideas. Heidegger says, well, you can't really do that in the world, but you can do the next best thing. You can convert that into a constant presence, and it is there just the way you want it. And by the way, this provides not only water, but half the reason this is being built, the reason that the Hoover Dam was built, and the reason Three Gorges Dam was built was to provide electricity as well. So now, you both turn a valve to get water and you turn the valve to get electricity as well. And we are the great beneficiaries of that because California still uses a good bit of our renewables actually still come from hydroelectric power, and the Hoover Dam is a big part of that. It's not the dam, right? The reservoir, it's not literally a metaphysical entity. It's not like it exists in heaven or in Plato's realm of ideas. But it's the next best thing to realizing this metaphysical ideal. The ever-changing river is now no longer an ever-changing river. It is a reservoir that is static, and we can do what we want with it. And that's the other issue. It's huge control that human beings now have. So human beings, you feel helpless living near a stream. You're afraid you're going to be in a drought or flood or whatever. You don't have to worry about anything. You are in control of that river. And it goes without saying, don't worry about there being a genus Loci to take care of the river. We are in control of the river. If there's a genus Loci there, it's irrelevant, right? It has no control over that, and we don't have to in any way make nice with it because, well, we are totally in control. It would be like a parallel project, right? Would be if Andy Goldsworthy did indeed carve one of those sculptures like that serpentine icicle out of marble. Why? To make it endure across time. It would be trying to stop phusis, trying to stop the endless play of absence and presence. And a dam just does that. I mean, not ultimately, right? I mean, this dam will not be there forever in the Rhine, nor will the Three Gorges Dam, as massive as it is, be there forever. And hundreds of years it will be gone. Heidegger argues that if you can wrap your head around this idea that this was our response to nature being unpredictable, it's one of the key features of technological modernity. And another example would be fossil fuels, which puts an end to the frustration that human beings have had for thousands of years with sporadically solar energy. So what do I mean by that? You may know that solar energy actually really is good for heating. If you ever get into a car on a cold day, if it's a sunny day, it's warmed it up pretty nicely. People have tried to build houses that way, which are heated by the sun. But there's a problem, right? And that is that on a cold day, on a cloudy day, it's not going to be very warm in that car. And at night, where there's no sun at all, it's not going to work. So what are you dealing with? The endless play of absence and presence. Sometimes the sun is there on a sunny day. Sometimes it's not on a cloudy day. It's never there in the evening. So how then do you use the sun as an energy source? Well, we are working on that now with photovoltaics, where we actually have, which are amazing technology that can convert photons into electrons. But aside from that, we've had this solution for hundreds of years, and that is fossilized solar energy. What's fossilized solar energy? It's fossil fuels. What do I mean by that? Well, the sun, hundreds of millions of years ago, came down on the planet. It caused plants to be born. Those plants didn't decay in the sense that the earth had a lot of water at the time. They went underneath that water, and instead of decaying, they were compressed into fossil fuel. So when we dig those up in the form of coal or petroleum oil or methane, so-called natural gas, CH4, when we dig that up, we are really talking about, fossilized solar energy. And you could see why this is a lot like the reservoir. Why? Because it is this permanent thing that isn't caught up in the cycle of endless change. So let me just continue. Sun's energy is like a streaming stream. Sometimes it streams down in the right amount. Sometimes it's maybe absent. Houses rely on solar energy for heat sometimes, but that doesn't work because it overloads. So what happens then? Fossilized solar energy becomes the solution. It's like the reservoir in the sense that it is stored up, and it just so happens that this particular way that it decayed and fossilized made that happen. And it then is ready to be deployed anytime. And this is why we love fossil fuels. We can click on a light switch and the lights will go on here. How is that possible? Well, there's a power plant. Maybe let's assume one is powered by fossil fuels in California. That wouldn't be coal-fired, but it would be methane, natural gas, and that's being burned to allow the lights here to stay on. And we love that. We can turn day into night. We can use it to heat the building. We can, make it. We have that as a present solar energy at any time. I hear people talking. You don't think it's loud? I can hear you even up here. I imagine people down there can hear you even more. Just a few more. Our love of fossil fuels is, in Heidegger's sense, metaphysical. Why? It's a frustration with physis. It's a frustration with things just happening when it happens. You could imagine how something would not be. So you would have like physis in the sense of having a windmill, and when the wind was turning the way it was traditionally with windmills, you could grind your wheat or whatever, but then it would be a problem when it wasn't turning at all. Let's call it a day. I'll finish this up next time. So Thursday we'll finish starting at 9, and we've already taken all of the yeah,